Hello, everyone. I'm Victor Lund. Welcome to today's M&A workshop. We're going to be talking about the value of home buyers under contract. I think this is a really important topic for our industry right now. The real estate industry went through a period where we adjusted to the settlement requirements of having every home buyer represented by a real estate agent through a unique contract. It was culminated through a change in MLS policy where the offer of compensation is no longer a requirement of the MLS. In fact, it's been eliminated completely from the MLS. So, the real estate brokerage community has long been diligent about collecting agreements, typically exclusive listing agreements whenever we're selling a home. But other than the 13 states that had some type of program for requiring buyer agency agreements, like usually those were signed at closing. We'll talk about a little bit about that later. But now that you have buyers under contract, those contracts become an asset of the brokerage. And we brought together an assembly of people who are going to look at that concept of buyers under contract being an asset of the brokerage to give some different perspectives on that, so that you might detail some plans in your firm to take some of the notions that we present here and drive value in your company. So I'd like to introduce the panelists that we've brought into today's workshop. I think each of them offers a very distinct area of expertise in this. George Slusser, my business partner who runs the M&A group, the mergers and acquisition group at WAV Group, is going to be here talking about how we calculate the value of a brokerage today, because there's always a carve out when you're valuing a real estate brokerage related to the listings under contract or pending listings under contract. And depending on the deal circumstances, those could be valued differently in terms of driving additional value to the company. He's going to explain that we've never looked at buyer agency agreements before in the reflection of this value. We've looked at other things that are facsimiles of that, which is historical transaction performance. But we're going to talk a little bit about how these buyer agreements might be treated a little differently and might be treated more akin to listing agreements moving forward. Another business partner of ours is David Gumper. He runs the WAV Group technology group. So when you think about these contracts that are being created, you think about your contract management systems, you think very deeply about your accounting systems and how you forecast revenue. And you also think about CRM, customer relationship management, and where a signed buyer agreement falls in the sales pipeline for your real estate agents, and then how you recognize that moment, that milestone, if you will, in the incubation of a buyer client over time. And then to keep it real, I have a great executive in real estate brokerage. He's a regional president for Fox and Roach, a Berkshire Hathaway Home Services company. And Brad manages lots of office managers, lots of real estate agents and teams. They just went through this incredible process of adjusting their business to reflect the settlements, and they're thinking about what their next steps are. But what makes Fox and Roach interesting is that back in 2016, they launched a product that really focused on home buyers as an asset. And they've had probably the most remarkable success in real estate around that product. So taking it this next step based upon the development of the offer of compensation being removed from the MLS and the timing of when a buyer agency agreement is signed between a consumer and a real estate agent and a real estate broker is very material to this topic. So you kind of have a lot of things that are all working together here in order to paint, what is probably a very blurry water brush painting of the changes that have happened in the real estate industry. But I think if we focus on it together with great people among the real estate brokerage community, we can come up with something that actually powers the industry forward in a much more positive light than simply reacting to a legal settlement. So just if you don't know WAV Group, just a little bit of background on us. And, I guess by way of introducing the first panelist here today, which is my partner, George Slesser, is that we built an M&A group with the deepest amount of experience of mergers and acquisitions in the nation. We are very, very active in representing brokerages both on the buy side and the sell side of mergers and acquisitions transactions. And we do a very, very significant amount of business just in valuations. Brokers coming to us and saying, what's my company worth? And they ask that question for a variety of reasons. It could impact some financing. It could impact some changes in the ownership structure of the company where they might be buying or selling some units. Or it could just be a way of understanding your value that you're creating over time, because much in the same way that you might create value in your asset portfolio by investing in stocks, even your business is often, along with your properties, the largest assets that an individual has. So anyway, if you ever need us for that stuff, we're there for you. George, welcome aboard. How are you today?
I am well. Thank you, Victor. And it's going to be an exciting panel because we're sort of figuring it out together, as Victor said. And I do a lot of valuations and we do a lot of M&A work, and it's changing, it's evolving. And just to give you a macro approach, historically, what we've looked at just is adjusted EBITDA. And when a company increases their enterprise value, we're really looking at their growth. What has it been historically? And then certainty of the adjusted earnings. What's it going to be next year and what's it going to be in the future? So it's always about sustainability of the earnings and the quality of the earnings, how important it is for the assets and are they going to stay? And then there's only a few things you can look at in a real estate company, and those are the tangible assets. And previously, there were only a few of those. So you've got furniture and fixtures, things that have been purchased, whether it be computer equipment or desks and chairs. And the agents, again, can move the next day. So you have to value those with a little grain of salt, but there's percentages that we've always used in valuing companies and how much of the revenue stream is going to be sustainable in the future. And then there's always been pending sales. And I'm not sure that's going to change drastically, but there are a few nuances with the new buyer agreements that I think we should talk about. And then listing inventory was always a cornerstone of evaluation. If you've got 100 listings, you can really determine, what those value of the listings are. And now we have a new thing called buy-side agreements in most companies and in most states, as Victor said. And those are new tangible assets. And what we're going to talk about today is really how to sort of plan for collecting data points on the tangible assets, and how to plan for really growing your company with now two sides to it, transactions. What data points are going to be important. So we knew what used to be important, but now we're going to talk about a whole new cadre of things called buy-side agreements for most companies, and that will be critical, I think, to future valuations. And we really need to know how they're valued. Are the buy-side agreements going to be valued differently than the listing inventory? And we'll talk a little bit about that today. We also have, in the past, most small roll-ins are paid either on an earn-out basis or a percentage of something. And most of those were paid on a percentage of listing inventory or percentage of real estate that was closed or pendings closed. But we've never really done anything with buy-side agreements. We think in the future that you're going to be able to, on small acquisitions or small sales of companies, that you're going to have two major assets that you're going to get paid on, which is both the listing inventory as they pend and they close, and then the buy-side agreements. So if you had 100 listings and 100 buy-side agreements, you're a whole lot better off than if you just had 100 listings. So I think in the future, those buy-side agreements are going to be incredibly important. And then earnouts, you can be structured in many, many different ways. And we've done that. Could be based on the gross revenue, the company dollar, can be based on adjusted earnings. But in many cases, with smaller companies especially, it's based on the listing inventory and the pendings. And we think in the future, it's going to be and buy-side agreements. In the past, we've valued the current listings. And Victor and I did a nice workbook that's part of an implementation series called Acquiring More Profit. And in this workbook, we actually have the grid, which you'll see on the right side of how you value a listing inventory. And it's pretty straightforward. You know, you take the volume of listing inventory, you take the sales rate, you take the net office commission of that, and then you can do a turnover rate from that, and you can actually project when on average those are going to close, and you can see what the listing inventory is going to turn into on a monetary basis. And you just add the days on the market and the processing time, and then you'll know exactly when that money should be coming. So if you're buying a company or selling a company, you'll know for certainty that this listing inventory will yield X% of the revenue of that company. And now we believe we can get much more exact in this science, because now we're going to have a listing inventory, but we're going to have a buyer agreement inventory. So you've got two things that are going to be pretty exact. So this is not going to happen today, but maybe in 6 months or a year, you're going to have really good data points where you can say, you know, we've got $7 million of buy-side agreements. And then you'll know, you know, what your typical sales rate is of those agreements. Once you get an agreement, you'll know what your net office commission is, your turnover rate, and then you can really project. So you wouldn't have to project, you know, we get X% from buy side and X% from listing inventory. You're going to know exactly our listing inventory is 60% of our revenue base, and our buy side agreements are 40% of our revenue base. So going forward, I think we're going to be much more exact in where the revenue is coming and how it's coming. And then we're going to have new data points, which is, you know, how many days in the market, for instance. When you get a buyer agreement under agreement initially, you know, how long does it take to get to pending, and how long does it take to get to close? And that's really why we've brought Brad in here, because from a practical standpoint, you know, they've been experiencing this and they've developed it over time. So we're just so pleased to have someone that's doing it on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to turn over the data point discussion to Brad.
Thank you, George. And it's a real pleasure and privilege to be here. As Victor alluded to, I'm part of Berkshire Hathaway, Fox and Roach. We consist of about 80 offices with 4,200 sales professionals. This year, we're set to close about 21,000 sales for about 12 billion in sales volume. So this is a great opportunity for us to really seize a new frontier with the understanding of true buyer agency contracts. I'm in the state of Pennsylvania, where since '99 we have been required to have a buyer agency contract signed, but it wasn't always signed early in the transaction. And we didn't have a definitive understanding of how many buyer agency contracts our sales professionals were with out in the field. So to take a pause and kind of think about what metrics we've been analyzing today as a company, we produce what we call our hotline. And that hotline takes into consideration our pended units, our pended volume, our average sale price for that given time period, listings taken, and we can analyze that. It's typically reset month to date, but we can configure the search to be year-to-date pendeds, listings taken, or month to date to give us an analysis and understanding of our future pipeline. But you know, if you think about listings taken, they'll obviously be future pendeds. We have no metric today, but we will be working on what are our buyer agency contracts pended to help us with the other side of the pended units and volume ledger. So if we think about what we want out of the metrics in the future, I think it's critical that we all understand that we have a real opportunity to gain greater intel as to our pipeline, as to the advantages from coaching agents where there may be fall throughs transactionally on the buy side. From a valuation standpoint that George is pointing to, there's a huge opportunity to increase and perhaps leverage the buy side transactions in our pipeline for the sale or financing or refinancing of a business. But we'll want to look at in the future days from initial contact that the consumer meets our agent to the buy-side agreement, what is the average buy-side agreement purchase price? How can we begin to help understand our pipeline of volume based on that average sale price of buyer agent contract in the kitty? Is that buyer pre-approved? Is it a formidable buyer? Does that buyer need to sell their current home, which may, from a fall-through standpoint, give it greater likelihood of not proceeding to a settlement? So is the buyer pre-approved? That would be a more qualified buyer. Is the buyer needing the contingency of their current home in order to make the purchase? The buy-side agreement sales rate percentage, we're discussing, again, those two previous factors will factor into, in my opinion, some percentage of fall-throughs of buyers that have signed agency contracts will not get to the settlement table. And we need to build that model, that formula, to achieve that expected outcome. Net office commission from buy-side agreements, buy-side agreement annual turnover, average percent of income from the buy side. We've got, looking at the milestones of a typical buyer transaction, the point of it being a lead to contract, to pending, to close, and understanding the tail of that entire time frame. The average buy side time in the market, start to purchase, and then finally average buy side time from purchase to close. So we'll dig into this deeper on our conversation, but those are some forward-thinking metrics that I believe, and we believe, that we will likely be paying attention to as we move forward on this path.
I love it. Let's bring David Gumper up, and maybe just pause the screen share for a minute. But David, talk to us, obviously from the perspective of Fox and Roach, they have different systems in their brokerage that they use for managing buyers. We'll dig into some of those specifically in a minute. But David, I think we talked earlier about the three cornerstones of managing buyer engagement. There's something that happens in the CRM. There's something that happens in the brokerage accounting system. And then there's other things, like other applications that people are using to work with buyers. Can you just talk to us a little bit about those applications, where you see the buyer agency agreement fitting in to each of those applications, just as a general architecture for brokers to start thinking about in terms of, all right, I have this buyer agency agreement. Where does it go? How do I track it? What systems do I use? You have to unmute too, otherwise you're.
The wind. I'm talking in the wind right now. So
Thanks, buddy.
thank you very much. Exactly what Brad had said just previous. There's a lot of data points to capture there too. So, and in order to get that business insight and be able to do the valuations that you're looking for in an M&A, we kind of looked, and a lot of this is still unknown, but I do know for a fact that, a lot of the CRMs, customer relationship management tools that are out there, you can you have your contact profile, right? And then as you interact with that customer, you can create either a buyer profile or a seller profile, right? And in the buyer side, most likely they should already have, I know a number of them already do, they should have like, hey, what's the target price that this customer is looking for, or what is a range, right? That's going to be data that is going to be very supportive of the metrics that Brad had put together and just showed on the previous slide. So, and I think that's where the best place, because it should, one of the places where it can live. The other piece that we didn't talk about before was sometimes in your transaction management platform, right? That is another great place, and maybe even a little bit better because maybe you have a little bit more control and so forth. So it's really going to be to for us, and we're taking a look at a lot of these systems as to where is it going to be that you're going to be able to pull the data from to be able to do something with it, right? We all have to take that data and, and I think for an M&A purposes, you're either going to do some descriptive analysis on it or predictive, right? Those are the two analytical approaches that you want to take. You want to be able to predict what's going to happen in the future based on the data you have. And you also kind of want to, take a look at what has happened, what has occurred, where are we historically and today. So that's where I think we're getting a lot of, we're looking for a lot of input from a lot of people, and then looking at different systems and seeing how we can capture that. And a lot of that's going to depend on your sales pipeline, right? It's going to depend on how are you treating these buyer agreements. What pathway are you taking to ensure that the agents are getting those agreements when they make first contact? How are you going to leverage that and make sure that that is being done? And then, it's also a lot of the stats that I'm looking at. It's also great training exercise at the same time, right? Education purposes. So that's what I think where we're going. What systems are going to be probably the best? The accounting system is great for numbers, but they don't store documents. And I know, you got to keep that buyer agreement someplace, right? It's got to be in that book of the transaction folder that we keep on a transaction or on a buyer. So that's kind of where we are at today.
And I think, David, that's a great jumping off point for our conversation here. Thank you so much. And thank you, Brad and George, for your contributions. Let's just talk a little bit about the buyer agency agreement. So my understanding is that the buyer agency agreement, it can be a form provided through the association, or it could be a broker form. Brad, what do you guys use in your market?
We have a proprietary form in the state of Pennsylvania, and we do require the agents to use the New Jersey state form just because it's a state required form.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a hybrid. In markets where we can have a proprietary form, we do.
So frequently the forms provider is either a solution that's offered as a member benefit, or it's offered through an MLS. I think enterprise companies like yours try to standardize on things that are going to serve the universal requirements of all Berkshire Hathaway Home Services company-owned stores. In other words, depending on your size, you could have a single point where the broker can rely upon those documents being created, or you could have variable points. So that's an issue too. Like what forms, like what is the form system that your buyer agency agreements are signed on? So if for every broker that's on the call today, that's the first thing you have to know. And if you're in multiple states, multiple areas, multiple MLSs, whatever, you're going to be required to identify all of those points. I think the second thing is that the decision made by the broker on who signs that form representing the company. So a lot of, in some states, the broker must sign the form. That makes the decision super easy.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely want to call, you definitely want to contact your Department of Real Estate or your association, probably at the state level, and find out, what the legal aspects are of it. I think Brad, in your market, the agents sign it, right?
We do. Yeah, we do allow the agents to sign it. And I think you're down the right path because obviously it is part of the settlement. We must have these documents signed at the point of procuring cause. So really encouraging the agents to sign it and then to have a repository, as we're looking at the hotline I mentioned, that's fed by DTR, DocuSign Transaction Room, listing, opening of rooms. We could do similar at the point the buyer contract room is open to then help us field the hotline on the buyer contracts in the future. So, having the agents understand the why in getting them to have the contract signed is already done for us. Now, what do we do with the data, and how do we assimilate it into a platform to develop these metrics?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like for the broker to have any shot at all on developing buyers under contract as an asset, the broker needs a copy of the deal. And so if in your brokerage you have agents entering into contracts with consumers and you're not even looking at the trade, looking at the deal, I think you have I think that you've short-stopped your success moving forward with this. Now, David, regardless, even if the broker allows the agent to sign the contract, aren't there settings in a lot of the popular transaction management solutions or forms management solutions? Like, I'm thinking mostly around zip forms, transaction desk, dot loop, docu. Don't they all have like settings to automatically copy the broker?
Yes, they do. They all have that setting if it's enabled and turned on, and if you have the right workflow process for it. I think from a standpoint of looking at this from, buyer agreements and getting some of this data, the challenges is not all their APIs it's not available. So, and that's the one thing that I kind of did my research on, was to take a look from a transaction management, especially like if we want to get, hey, what is the, what's the target price that my buyer or my customer is looking to get, or what's that price range that they're looking to have? That's going to be very important to get that data. And I think that's where some of that data is. And maybe there should be a conversation of how can we get that, that kind of data that's kind of sitting outside of the buyer's agreement. It's really only one place, and that's the agent's head up here, right? Because they're working with that buyer. But now it's going to be very imperative that we capture that data, so that way we can be able to do, as I mentioned before, go through and do the analysis and take a look at the insights that we can gain that both Brad and George had mentioned, to be able to report on, both either whether from an M&A, but just to have general insights of your business. Where is it going? Where is it heading? Where are the gaps? What needs, who needs more education? Who doesn't need any more education? Where should I be focusing more on my marketing and target marketing from as a brokerage? Or where can I go and get target agents and let them know, hey, this is where you're at in that market, right? Based on buyer agreements and so forth. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but I think there's a number of items that are going to need to be, updated in a lot of these platforms to be able to move that data, that information around, so that it can be leveraged for business intelligence.
So let's talk about a couple of things there. I just want to recap items that popped out at me while you were talking. First of all, API is an application programming interface. What that means is that when a buyer agency agreement is signed, you as the broker, in cooperation with your IT staff or with the technology companies that you're partnered with, need to take that action and move that information into something.
Yep.
So, if you're using a forms solution provided by your MLS or association, you need to then go and say, well, where do I want to put it? So if, for example, you are, your broker technology vendor is, one of the big, Bold Trail or Moxie Works, or who are you guys using now, Brad? You use Reliance Networks, whatever. There's literally hundreds of broker technology companies out there, but connecting the CRM that the agent uses every day with your transaction management system, so that document goes right into the customer record.
Yep.
You also need to make sure that document goes into the customer record of the broker. And the broker doesn't have a customer record. The broker doesn't have a CRM. What the broker has is an accounting system. So I think when you understand where that information needs to flow off the signed form, it can be routed using APIs directly into the places where it needs to go. So creating a brainstorm, if you will, in your brokerage around the tools and services that you have available to you, that would benefit from having that data, I think is the first step. Now, the second step is the stuff George needs. So George, the customer name and the payment that the customer is going to make to the firm are certainly two data points that we will get off that form, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we won't, right?
No doubt. And that was sort of the laundry list of what Brad was talking about.
Yeah.
The more information you can get, the better. Again, it's going to be incredibly hard, but I think at some point the data providers are going to have to make it a lot easier on the buy side, similar to how we've done it on transaction management on the listing side. It's almost of equal importance that we have all those data points.
So the first item that was on that list, and by the way, a couple of people have asked for the slide deck. Yeah, you're going to get the slide deck. You're going to get the recording of it. You'll have all that. But the first item on the list was days from initial contract to the buy side agreement. So this is a number that I think is so very important. The YLOPO, who's this really stands in a group by themselves in terms of lead generation as a company. They work with top producing agents and teams who literally spend over $100,000 a month on generating business income. They just said something pretty monumental, maybe by accident, last month, which was the lead incubation time of a home buyer just moved from 12 to 13 months. That's the average. In other words, from the initial touch point where a consumer, say, registers or request, like they provide their name and email address or phone number information or whatever they provide during a lead capture event, that's really the top of the funnel. You don't know when the consumer comes in how close they are to transaction when they come in, right? A lot of people seem to search and watch and look and feel and smell real estate information for a very long time, even before they're ready to embark on any action which would mandate the signing of a broker agency agreement. Now, Brad, you said something interesting before, and I'm not sure if it's just something that's regional to your marketplace, but you said that the procuring cause is the moment that the buyer agency agreement needs to be signed. I think in a lot of states that's not true. It's when the requirement is when you're going to show a listing.
Yeah, it's the first substantive business interaction.
Okay, thank you.
So agents, can host an open house,
Right,
and not require a buyer agency contract be signed to the open house attendees. But let's say that a consumer approaches you at that open house, they want to go look at other properties. You begin to have a business substantive conversation, you need to have a buyer agency contract signed. It is in advance of procuring costs, correct?
Thank you.
It depends on the deal. It could be
I got
one
it.
and the same, but
Make
yes.
sure that we were all on the same page. So
Yes, sir.
when we think about just the sales funnel or the sales timeline, I don't know, however people look at it, there's certainly this big top of the funnel that people talk about all the time. It's I think the loving relationship that real estate has to these people is their looky-loos, right? They're just very interested for whatever reason in what's happening in real estate. And then at some point they become serious. It's the difference between asking an agent, what's my home worth, and signing a contract to list my home for sale. I'm not under contract with the buyer agent. I'm interested in real estate. I'm registered for stuff. I'm learning. But when I'm ready to look at homes and start making offers on properties, it's that point that I convert to a listing contract. So that is from the metric that you want, George, that's the number, right? I want to know the day that listing agreement was signed, because that's the date at which I can begin to age the value of this asset and predict a closing term line. Like, Brad, when you do listings agreements today, like what, 90% of them trade in 30 days or less?
Yeah, absolutely. 28 days, average days on market. So 30 days or less. And, we know that there's a appended with certainty on 90% of the transactions. Our fall through rates depending on the month, 4 to 8%. So.
Yeah, single digits. And George, do you discount when you're doing valuations? Do you discount the likelihood of a transaction if it's like over 90 or 120 days, or do you just leave it? Do you treat them all the same?
Yeah, we usually look at the fall through rate of the historical averages. So that's what we would use on valuing the listing contract. And that's what we want to do on the buy side now is to value how long is that going to take and what's the fall through rate. And so you've got two different fall through rates now.
Yeah. And we don't, and there's no data that
Yeah.
speculates on the time to close. And one of the reasons why there really isn't no data or any data is that, we have been in this crazy rush to educate realtors and real estate agents that they need to go out there and get an agreement signed with every buyer. Well, they just did that, but it's for every phase of their funnel. Wherever they had a buyer who would enter into an agreement, they went and got it signed, and it could have been somebody who's about to trade next week, next month, or in 6 months from now. But it's just that original start date of the contract is something that you need to capture. We can get that off the form, which is good news. But now once we need it, we need to start a meter ticking on how these things are aging. Now, Brad, in your offices, do you guys still have like the board that has listings on it, or did you guys?
Great. Yeah, I went to the fridge to get my water on the way to this great meeting, and I passed our sales boards where we have listings taken on whiteboards that are lined out and our sales, but no buyer agency contracts taken.
Looks like you're buying some new whiteboards.
I think we are buying a couple more.
Okay,
or we'll make it a digital display, even better.
Yeah,
exactly.
Sure. Yeah, that's what gets David Gumper up in the morning. So now one of the data points that nobody's collecting today on the buyer agency agreement is any notion of price point. So the seller agrees to a listing price in the listing agreement, and we can consume that information off the form. Now we're in a situation where we have an agreement. It's missing important details on the enterprise value of this transaction. So how do we append that information? And I'll just push this to David Gumper. How do we get the agent to acknowledge to the broker? I mean, usually people are in a price range, but we need to pick a number. It should probably be the top end of that range, right? If I'm going to get one number, what's the most the consumer will pay?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think that's still left to be determined. I think in the future, as we go down the pathway of capturing this data, there's going to be, I think for right now, more than likely, it probably would be the top end of that number, or at least 0.75%. I wouldn't say it's 50-50 because we all know we all try to buy low, right? And we end up buying a lot more than what we usually intend to do. I know I did last year. So when I moved to North Carolina, so it was kind of like, hey, look, how do we capture that? And then it's more important to see, well, what number do we use from an evaluation once we have that buyer agreement and what we use? I think there needs to be some study and research to be done just to see how far off. And you're not going to know that till once it's pending, then you're going to have a better idea from a pending state. But there's also things that could happen that could drive that number up or down at the closing as well too. So I think there's going to be some real interesting, if once we collect that data point and start looking at it and doing the analysis, I think there'll be some standards that will come out of it.
Victor, if I could for a minute.
Go for it, Brad.
Yeah, I saw a great question. How are we going to encourage agents to input this data? And I think that's something on the brokerage side we're always struggling with. They've got to see the value in taking any time extra to input anything of value. And when we first spoke, Victor, obviously we see a great deal of opportunity going on a listing appointment, and we've been using buy side since 2016, but going on a listing appointment.
But we'll get back to that in just a second.
Okay. Trying to understand the power of this data on a listing presentation to an agent. And and we'll talk about that further, I think is the point of interest to that agent that, hey, by me contributing data, I'm going to benefit from the data being input, and it's going to help me in my business. And I think that's really what we have to dig into. And the tech interface that David was touching on between our using KV Core and Moxie and DTR and all these different software tools to generate the right metrics and output that gives us quantifiable data that's not only to the company's benefit, but also to the agent's benefit in their business building.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, if you're a broker who creates your own forms, putting in a little data opportunity to collect, estimated, transaction budget or something like that, would give you a data point in the form. So if you're doing your own forms and you can control the data, I think that's something that you'll certainly want to look at. Because then we can, I don't know if for people that aren't super techie, any data that the agent or, that's inputted into the form can be extracted. That data can be pulled off and pushed somewhere else without rekeying it. So you definitely want to do that. I mean, if you're a small firm, you probably don't care. And, similarly, smaller firms could just ask the agent, hey, congratulations on your new buyer agency agreement. Can you give me can you just email me back an answer to, how much are they planning to spend, or are they financials, have they been approved for financing yet, or some other questions that I think are pretty relevant. Those are the things that, again, if you hearken back to what George outlined in terms of the ability to put a value on this asset, you do need this other information. And I think if you're not using your own forms managed, that you build yourself as a broker, you're using something like a zip forms or transaction desk forms or a DocuSign form. The thing that every broker should know is that you can append, meaning you can add a page to that buyer agency agreement that's only used by your agents at your brokerage. And just as an aside, you can also add your logo and things like that. So those agreements, even though they're provided by the state of the MLS, they can be branded to you as a broker. Take advantage of those tools. And again, learn in the setup how you can make sure that you get a copy of them no matter what. And then you'll have to determine on your own what things that you capture which aren't on there. So if you need to add this extra form to get the estimated budget price or whatever, however you want to say that, definitely do that. Now, George, we don't have any data on the likelihood of fall through, but that would need to be something that you would probably want the accounting system to provide you when you get the overall financials. So David, how do you do that in the accounting system? I mean, we do track pendings and lost sales on listings. How are you going to do it with the buyer? Is same way? You need to unmute, buddy.
Sorry, I just used to. They're mowing out here, so that's a great question. I mean, we're going to use the accounting system when the deal falls through, right? Because you got to mark it in there. I guess for me the biggest question is, why did it fall through? We pretty much all kind of know based on our years of experience what that listing, when it does fall through, we try to get it from the seller or so forth, or from the buyer, but it's not documented anywhere. It's not stored. And that's the caveat on it. So that way you can actually, leverage that to insight. But it's just like, I know from the other accounting systems, you have pending it's just another status for that contract, right? So deal falling through, DFT or whatever you want to call it. That can be captured based upon the contract in the accounting system. But why? That is another whole story, and I think that's going to be an important, talking point, both with your listing agents as well as your buyer agents, right? That's the best answer I have for right now, Victor. It's just That's it.
Yeah. So I guess the guidance here is log your agreements into your accounting system for buyers the same way you do for listings. And you'll have to get this additive information around the value of the contract, and you'll begin to track what the cancellation rate is. And I mean,
Well,
it's
I think most brokerages do that already, right? I mean, if you only have the
buyer agreements, not on
you know,
listing agreements, or I mean, on listing agreements, not on buyer agreements.
yeah, but you're going to know who the buyer is on the contract, and then you got to match it, right? I guess I'm going a
Yeah,
little,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I
yeah.
mean,
So,
it's the same way, but I mean, I just think that the enterprise value and, and if you can go back, when we value a brokerage, George goes through a pretty systematic system of saying, this is the percentage of estimated value of your listing contracts. Now we're going to say, well, if you have this many listing contracts, depending on their aging, we can forecast when they're likely to convert and what the enterprise value of that conversion will be in terms of GCI. And that will be able to, we'll factor a confidence against that to say the brokerage is worth this much money. So the good news for all the brokers on the call today is for the very first time, you just doubled the value of your brokerage. Because you have buyer agency agreements, there's certainty or some measure of certainty around them. And, I absolutely believe that if brokerages will begin collecting this information correctly, sharing it with, companies like ours who are doing valuations or entering into mergers and acquisitions, the brokerage who's got this buttoned up as best as possible is going to be in a position of strength. They're going to be in a position to win. Now, I want to go back to this.
Victor,
Yeah,
let
go
me
ahead.
just say that. So I really want the information from a valuation standpoint is really going to help. But I think Brad said this earlier, that from a coaching or development standpoint with the agent, we've totally not done anything on the buy side ever. And now I think you have the opportunity. That's why you want to collect the data to improve your quality of your agent.
Yeah, I would agree, George. I think there's a real opportunity there from a business development standpoint. And, one other highlight, think about the agents. I mean, we all know that in the industry, listings are gold. The majority of agents go after listings, but there's a certain profile of real estate professionals that focus on serving buyers. And in the valuation of the property, of the company rather, we're overlooking those many agents that prefer to work solely with buyers. And there's a great deal of transactions unnoticed in the valuation at that time.
Yeah, can we just talk a little bit about, because I think this is important. Brad, you guys launched back in 2016 a product called Buyside. The commercial name for that company now is called Percy.ai. Explain in your words what that is and how you guys have been using that for nearly a decade to demonstrate value around the buyers that you have across your network.
Yeah, I mean, it's got a number of facets that are very powerful for our firm. But one of the key relevant items as it relates to this conversation is a sense of saved buyer searches. And on the flip side, I'm going out for a listing. I put the property address into Buyside or Percy AI. It will give me a generated report that acknowledges the number of active buyers with a search profile that this subject listing property would fulfill. And I can go out with this printed report included in my CMA and present it to the seller that there's 66 active buyers in our system that are ready, willing, and able to buy. And those are just buyer searches. If I can go out with quantifiable signed buyer agency contract data, taking it a step further, how impressed would a seller be in the pursuit? Wow, I've got to work with Berkshire Hathaway or whatever your company's name is, as you hold, that many certified with buyer agency contract, ready to go buyers with their property. It can be an extremely powerful listing tool. It already is.
Yeah, just and for the other brokerage firms on here, the Percy product, which is for sale and available, it has two methods of getting buyer data. The first method is that it will ingest all of the buyer leads that are created on your broker website or any of the connected agent websites. Like most brokers have like what they call co-branded agent website. They give an agent to them, and it's tied to their CRM. So in the CRM, wherever there's a saved search and whatever those saved search attributes are, those automatically get loaded into this Percy AI product. The second way is for a real estate agent to key in their buyer information. So if you have Percy AI, that might be a data input location where you definitely want to put all of the buyers under contract. Because there's another element in Percy AI that it's really cool, which is what they call a lead score, right? And I don't know all of the dynamics of it, but they kind of rank buyers in level of seriousness. I know one of the attributes that they had before, which was very material to your mortgage company, Trident Group, is whether or not that consumer is pre-approved or not. You know, is their financing locked in? So it's one thing to save a search on a website. It's another thing to be pre-approved. And I think it's even another thing to be under contract with a real estate agent. So the rank and quality of this scoring through products like Percy AI, I think are really interesting. I know Dimitri asked if there's, he asked a question earlier. Thank you for your question, Dimitri. But he asked a question of, you know, do we think that there are going to be any legit buyer registries in the marketplace? And I guess I'll let everybody answer that. My answer is, I think it should be at the state level, mostly because you have a lot of overlapping market disorder with MLSs and associations. There's like 40% of the brokerages who belong to an MLS belong to a second MLS. You guys belong to dozens, right? So I think at the state level, it would be really helpful for the state to offer a buyer registry because, hey, if I'm talking to a customer, I'm about to put them under contract, the ability to go and look and say, oh, is that person already signed up with an agent or not? You know, that is the sort of the boundary water, if you will, of the association arbitration policy, is to adjudicate conflicts of, but you know, procuring cause, right? So that's my answer. Brad, what's yours?
I mean, highlighting the fact that we do practice, and I'm sure many of us do, in multiple MLSs, and multiple MLSs are today the governing body of buyer agency contracts. I think it's got to be at the state level. And I really think that makes a lot of sense. And if you had the ability to assess whether that there's a name match to that buyer agent, that buyer that you've now got an agency contract with, would be even a better step. Yeah.
David?
I just want access to the data. No, but and actually, I mean, think about how many people move from one state to another state. I mean, it almost might even lend itself from a national level, right? So, you know, like for me, I still have a place in Florida, and I have this new place here in North Carolina, and you know, I bounce back between both of them. They all have different rules, and what if I am, you know, like right now I'm in North Carolina, but you know, next month I'm going to be looking for some property down in Florida again. So why, you know, I'm not going to be on any Florida registry at this point. So it might look that way. That's kind of my thoughts on that.
George?
Yeah, I'll defer to you guys on the registry. It's not my bailiwick.
Yeah, just show me how many you got and what
Yeah.
the economic value is to the brokerage. Well, that's great. Let me just check the chat for additional questions here. Tammy, Dimitri, the deck is going to be shared. The slides are in deck. Steve recording. Kevin, gotcha. So getting agents to input the data. Yeah, Steve Hayes, great comment. I think we addressed that earlier on. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, there has to be some cultural bias here. You know, one of the things that I want to close on, since we have a few more minutes, is I think a hot topic, which is I believe every brokerage has a policy in place for what happens when you're recruiting an agent into the firm or an agent is leaving the firm and they have listing agreements. Brad, talk to us about, I mean, I know that your policy is just one out of 85,000, but what's the common policy that you see among brokerages mitigating the separation, if you will, or the joining of an agent who has listings under contract? And then how might that inform what you do with buyers under contract? Because the contracts are always with the broker. They're never with the agent.
Yeah, as you know, period. That's the end of the story. But obviously, agents acknowledge that they've got the relationship with the client oftentimes. I think many brokerages have a policy that, reduces the agent's compensation at the time of departure, depending on where it is in the transaction. If it's just a listing, it might be a much lower compensation to the agent than once it's pended, but it's dependent on, broker to broker. I think, we're certainly looking at, and to the point of the question you just raised, we want to encourage agents to submit their buyer agency contracts and track them. We don't want to have an onerous policy that precludes them from submitting the buyer agency contracts at the time if they were to depart, and I hope they never do. We wouldn't have the buyer agency contract to then enforce a determination policy if that's something we decided to do. So it is something that I think is part of our business discussions is on the table, how to treat the termination clause when it comes to buyer agency contract. But I think of more value to me is how do we get the data we're all discussing here today? And I think it's a balancing act to achieve that.
Yeah, well, it seems like from your perspective, the broker policy needs to be created and you probably need to articulate it into your independent contractor agreement.
Yeah, it certainly needs to be discussed and addressed.
Yeah. And this might be, if you are updating your independent contractor agreement, might be an opportunity to, compel the agent, to Steve's point, to provide this information because of its enterprise value to the company. And I think all of the, all of the opportunities that you would have as a brokerage firm in a non-competitive way in cooperation with your real estate agents to deliver more information and more services to that home buyer will all come to present, in a much more meaningful way. I know for Trident Group, if you could get upstream in working with these home buyers to get them pre-qualified and make them a ready buyer, that's certainly going to position that buyer for success, that agent for that success, and obviously the brokerage and the mortgage partner for success. So I see that as quite a significant opportunity. And George, I know when you look at companies that have home services businesses and you look at, what the enterprise value is of a customer record, certainly having that pre-approval and that buyer contract is going to have a meaningful forecast change for the mortgage company too, right?
That's huge. Yeah. Again, certainty of earnings. And when you have that information, number one, and then an agreement, number two, or pre-qualifications, all of that's really important in evaluation is to look at what's the capture rate and how good is the capture rate.
Excellent. Well, we're at time here. I want to thank all my panelists. George, your expertise in mergers and acquisitions is unsurpassed, and I always appreciate and value all of your input. Brad, thank you for jumping on with us today. I know you're a busy guy. You have a lot of agents to provide care and feeding to. So I thank you for sharing everything. Of course, David Gumper, your insights on tech are always beyond what most of us can understand, but I think, everybody needs to appreciate how this information is going to become, an accessible data point for companies that are doing valuations or understanding their enterprise value as a brokerage. So I appreciate all that. If you guys have questions, reach out to me, victor@wavegroup.com. That's my cell phone. You can call me, text me anytime. I love it. George@wavegroup.com if you need a valuation done on your business. David for tech. Brad, by the way, if you want to sell your company, Fox and Roach is very interested, especially if you're in one of their key growth markets. So
always room for growth, but an honor to be here. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. And so we'll get the recording and the deck out to everybody that has registered today. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.